All right, I see participants are joining. I'm going to let that number of participants rack up a little bit longer. But for those of you joining the call, thank you for attending today's Worldwide Lab. Today, it is on behalf of the PGC Outreach Committee. I will be doing the intros. My name is Jerry Guintivano. I am co-chair of the PGC Outreach Committee, along with Helena Davies, who will also be presenting. Helena, let me do my introductions. Helena Davies is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Eating and Feeding Disorders Research Center at the Medical Health Center in Ballerup in Copenhagen, Denmark. She will also be joined in her talk by Niamh Ryan, who is a senior research fellow at Trinity College Dublin. And then we will also have a talk by Dr. Cindy Bulik, who is a professor of psychiatry and nutrition at the Gillings School of Public Health at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also the founding director of the UNC Center for Eating Disorder Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders, the professor in the Department of Medical Epidemiology and Biostatistics, as well as the director for Eating Disorders Innovation at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. And her talk will emphasize her passion for engaging stakeholders in science and disseminating scientific findings to the public. So we have a great panel for you all today. I will hand it over to Helena, where she will begin to speak about outreach in general, and we'll start to focus down with every speaker. I will want to say also, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat. And we will also have a Q&A session at the end of our presentations if you want to ask questions then as well. Over to you, Helena.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. Can you see my slides okay? Great. Yeah. Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about outreach in science, specifically psychiatric genetics, and why we should be doing it. So just to start, what is outreach? I'm going to touch on 3 core components that we at the PGC Outreach Committee are focusing on. So first off is science communication. And I'm just going to mention here that I'm referring to the public in quotations, as I know you can't really refer to them as one homogeneous group, but for the sake of this presentation, I will be. And what I mean here is just anyone outside of our psychiatric genetics community. So the older, more traditional model of science communication is this idea that scientists and other experts possess crucial knowledge that non-scientists or the public lack, and that the purpose of science communication is to fill these knowledge gaps in a one-way flow of information from expert to layperson, with this implicit assumption that scientific expertise is dominant over other forms of knowledge. And today, communication experts consider the deficit model to be obsolete, and for the past 20 years or so, more bidirectional forms of science communication have become popular, and we're now moving more towards science communication and engagement. So in the dialogue model, non-scientific forms of knowledge, such as the knowledge of the public, are considered to have equal value, and therefore the public need to communicate with us as much as we need to communicate with them. So this leads into the second component of outreach, which is collaborative research or patient-public involvement in research. And it's a good example of the dialogue model. And this means involving communities in the designing of studies, the interpretation and communication of results. And I won't say more on this, but stay tuned for Cindy's talk, and she'll give some examples of this in her own work. But another great example of this is the Native Biodata Consortium. So this is a research institute led by Indigenous scientists and tribal members in the US, and has meant that they have control over the research questions, the data ownership, and the building of trust in the communities that they're researching. So the third pillar of outreach that we do at PGC Outreach Committee is made up of trying to understand how our work fits into society. So we can apply our academic skills and scientifically study how psychiatric genetics is going to best fit into wider society. And there are really many brilliant examples of this. And personally, I'm hopeful that this work will become more and more an integral part of our research, as without it, we're pretty stuck in terms of effectively taking our research beyond the confines of academia and into the wider world. So that was a very brief tour through what outreach is, or what we at the committee consider outreach to be. But why do we need to do it? So this paper came out earlier this year by Jose Morosoli, and they looked at trends in around 3,500 GWAS publications on 5,000 websites. And they found that around 1/4 of these GWAS studies received media attention, which is not bad. But of that quarter, almost all of the media coverage would need around 12 or more years of a formal education to fully understand their content. And to kind of put this into context a little bit, general online media, such as that produced by the Huffington Post or CNN, is about 5 times less complex than that. And whilst it's not our fault that people in the media take our work and run with it, it is our responsibility to be good stewards of the work that we do. So if we can guide the media, and this is where that dialogue model comes into play, we should be doing so. So we should be engaging in an open dialogue with the media and working alongside them to develop ways of communicating our work that are better received by the public. So the message here really is just that media coverage of genetic studies is really poor, and therefore outreach from us as a community is important in order to try and improve this or to counter any unwanted consequences of it. So outreach also matters because the field we work in is really complex. So this paper here really nicely goes into the specifics of this, one of which being that psychiatry is really complicated. So psychiatric disorders are highly stigmatized, and they're also really hard to diagnose clinically and hard to measure scientifically. And then when you have this complexity of psychiatry, and then you add the complexity of genetics and this widespread belief in genetic determinism, plus the fact that lay understandings of statistical risk are generally quite poor, you get a really complicated mix of concepts and ideas that require a lot of care and attention in order to communicate them in a responsible and accurate way. So the message here really is that outreach matters in psychiatric genetics because our field has particular challenges that some other fields don't, and therefore there are many opportunities for misunderstandings. And many studies have actually looked at the consequences of such misunderstandings of psychiatric genetic risk, and they are quite broad-ranging. So, for example, people have indicated that they might choose to have fewer or no children, or that they might believe that their lifestyle will therefore have no influence on their risk and therefore engage less with health-related behaviours. And many of these beliefs are kind of rooted in this mistaken idea that your genes are your destiny. So the message here is that there are potentially serious and worrying consequences to misunderstanding psychiatric genetic risk. And I hope that this should motivate us all as a community to try and counter this. So still on the topic of why it matters, but kind of taking a bit of a step back and looking at the broader picture, there are many examples of genetic data being arguably misused in the modern commercial world. And all of the examples I'm going to give are from the past year. And I just wanted to do that to try and highlight how much this is going on right now. So in October this year, a UK newspaper uncovered a story that a US startup, Heliospec Genomics, was offering couples embryo screening on the basis of IQ. And in December last year, the FDA approved the first genetic test for opioid use disorder. And this is for adolescents who are being considered for prescription of opioid pain medication to treat acute pain, such as following surgery. In June 23andMe added bipolar disorder to its list of psychiatric traits that it provides polygenic risk scores for, although you have to be a premium member to get access to this. And you probably all remember around this time last year when Orchid Health announced that it would be using whole genome sequencing for embryos, and that this included testing for schizophrenia. And importantly, members of our community have responded to these events, and these are really great examples of where people have taken their responsibility as scientists to call out misuse of genetic data. So going one step even further, outreach from our community is really important because there are some instances where genetic data are being misappropriated to support hateful views. So this paper describes how for a long time people have turned science towards racist ends, but that there are several interconnected factors that distinguish the current efforts that are going on today. One of which being the internet. So the internet has made it dramatically more easy to search for and distribute racist ideas, and it also enables collaboration and the coalescence of communities of interest. Second is the sophistication and the DIY ethos of the current efforts. So there's a large citizen science component of people who are actively interpreting existing research and also generating their own. And then also there's the fact that genetic information is widely available, both in the form of public databases and direct-to-consumer genetic tests. So just to give you an example of each of these three things, so starting with the internet. So this paper looked at 330,000 Twitter or X posts regarding 1,800 bioRxiv preprints. And they found that around 10%, so around 180 papers had at least 5% of tweets from users linked to far-right extremist networks. And actually 12 of these papers had more than 1/3 of tweets from users linked to far-right extremist networks. And what's kind of important for our community is that the authors noted that these users appeared to be especially active in their engagement with preprints concerning the genetic architecture of behavioral traits, human population genetics, and ancient DNA research. So another example of this misappropriation, which is enabled by this DIY ethos and the exploitation of the principles of open science and therefore the availability of genetic data, is this quote-unquote journal that launched in the 60s and uses some of the same genetic data that we use to publish pseudoscience, which they then label as research articles. And this is a really important article written by an academic philosopher who notes this idea that our role as scientists is to seek the truth, whatever that might be, and then that's where our role ends. But the author kind of very nicely argues that actually we have much more of a responsibility than that as scientists. And talking about the practical steps of what we can do is beyond the scope of this talk, but I would like to refer you to this paper by Jedediah Carlson and also Evan Giangrande's WCPG talk this year, both of which touch on concrete ways in which we can counter this misappropriation of our data and of our research, and many of which are outreach related. So I just want to outline a case study of perhaps a missed opportunity for outreach. So Spectrum 10K was a research study that aimed to better understand autistic people's mental and physical health, and it launched in August 2021. Very shortly after its launch, concerns were raised by the autism community, and there was quite an extensive list, but it included, for example, the lack of support and information to autistic people who may have been triggered by the nature of the study, the lack of clarity in the consent form, the lack of information on the regulation and the protection of the genetic data, and the fact that autistic voices did not appear to be centered in the study. So 3 weeks after its launch, the study was voluntarily paused by the PIs. And whilst the Research Ethics Committee in England and Scotland had already approved Spectrum 10K, the Health Research Authority, which oversees both of those ethics committees, initiated its own review in September 2021. And in December, the study launched its own 3-phase internal review, which included consultancy from Hopkins Van Mill. And they stated that this review seeks to hear and understand the views of people who are concerned with or affected by the issues raised. So in May 2022, the HRA approved the study, pending a few changes, such as that to the consent process. And in August 2023, the Spectrum 10K research team published an update on their consultation, and they said that the official report would be published soon. But this article in March this year was released saying that it was delayed. And as of today, and this is to the best of my knowledge, the study is still paused. And I think this is an important example of a missed opportunity for effective outreach, and it demonstrates the potentially serious consequences of not doing so. So the study has unfortunately been paused for over 3 years and no data have been collected. And it just shows that a lack of effective outreach can have implications for science and discovery. And this article here just nicely outlines how outreach and public engagement are so often seen as an afterthought, when actually it should form part of our research practices from the very beginning, and that it's part of our role as scientists to be engaging with this. So with all of that being said, what is the PGC Outreach Committee? So it was founded in 2016, and here are most of our members. And really, we hope to just improve the visibility, accessibility, and understanding of psychiatric genetics, both within our own community and outside of it. We also hope that we can build trust in our community and encourage involvement and participation in our research. So some of the things we do, so we put on events. So at WCPG this year in Singapore, we put on a symposium and a panel discussion discussing the importance of language in a diverse world with a focus on science communication. And we had 4 fantastic speakers who spoke about a really great range of topics, and it was a super interesting discussion. We also kind of engage in science communication. As we move forward, we'll be kind of moving more towards a science communication and engagement model, as I mentioned at the beginning. So for example, we have the PGC groups taking over our social media accounts. And this year we tried to do something a bit different, where we had different groups taking over our accounts. So we had the King's College London's anti-racism working group taking over and giving us a different perspective. And before I joined the PGC Outreach Committee, they did a huge amount of work on updating the PGC website with information about genetics for the public. So we also are doing work to try and better understand our community. And I'm now going to pass over to Niamh, who's going to talk you through some preliminary results from our survey from WCPG.
Thank you so much, Helena. So I'm just going to share my slides. So can you see my slides? No. I'll try that again. Okay, there we go. Can you see them now? Yeah, great. So we had a wonderful success at the World Congress this year, both with our symposium, but also taking the opportunity to engage with the wider psychiatric genetics community to try and get an understanding of both the use and intended use of outreach within the broader field of psychiatric genetics. So the motivation for us sharing this questionnaire included so we wanted, as a PGC Outreach Committee, to find out how we can best support PGC members in their own outreach activities. And to do this, we shared this questionnaire to understand the awareness, perception, and use of PPI within the community, as well as the barriers to its use. Why is it that some people don't actually use PPI in outreach? So the questionnaire that we shared had 6 different sections, and I'm going to briefly touch on each of these in the next couple of minutes. So the first thing is that we had a really good uptake. We had 55 individuals take part in our survey. Of this, more than 70% were based in Europe, more than 12% were based in North America, and the remainder of the cohort were based across Africa, Asia, Australia, Oceania, and South America. Another really nice point about the participants was that we had a really nice equal sharing of use of the survey across different career stages. And we had about a third of the participants were PhD students, a third were postdocs, and a third were PIs. So we felt that this was giving us a really nice broad view of PPI across different career points. The first thing we asked was understanding and awareness of PPI. What terms have you used before? Because language is so important, and different individuals might have heard of different terms more than others. And indeed, community engagement was the most recognized term, followed by outreach and public participation, with PPI, public and patient involvement. Maybe it's a newer term or more region specific, and so it was less well known. But encouragingly, everyone had heard of at least one term. Then we asked usage. So do you currently use PPI or outreach at the moment? And we found that 42% of responders do currently do PPI, but 40% don't, and 18% were not sure. And this was a really valid point for us as the outreach committee to try and see, well, maybe reasons why people are unsure is that they don't actually understand what PPI is. So there's room and scope for growth, not just encouraging more people to take part in PPI and outreach, but also educating about different forms of PPI. So of the people who do take part in PPI, we asked, why do you take part in PPI? And it was interesting to see that, as well as saying that they do it because they're required by their grant or their funder or their institute, the vast majority of individuals actually also said they do it because it's something they value. So they do it because they want to do it, as well as it being required by other individuals. For the 40% who don't do PPI, the biggest reason for not doing PPI is not having the necessary skills. And this was also a really interesting point for us, because we want to help educate people and make it easier for them to take part in these activities. So we then asked how the survey users perceived PPI, and we gave them a list of positive and negative words that might be associated with PPI and outreach. And encouragingly, we found that there were a large number of positive words that people were associating with PPI. People thought that it was inclusive, informative, educational, and impactful, being the 4 most selected responses. But on the other side of it, 70% of people, more than 70% of people, said that it's very time consuming, it's complicated, there's an effort to it, and it's costly. So a lot of good positive points, but it's important to recognize the reasons why people aren't actually taking part in PPI. So then we asked, were there particular barriers to individuals' use of PPI? And again, 80% of people said yes, that they did think that there were barriers to their use of PPI. And when we asked specifically what those barriers might be, the top 5 were time, funding, staff, a lack of current relationship with stakeholders, and again, knowledge. So these were all very pertinent points to be raised. And then we also asked, were there barriers that we did did our users think that there were barriers that are specific to psychiatric genetics research? And interestingly, 77% of people thought that there were barriers specific to psychiatric genetics research. And when we dug into that a little bit further, the main barriers seem to be historic misuse of genetic data leading to mistrust particularly from minority groups, and then concerns about misuse of genetic data going forward, either for identification purposes or from private companies. So then we asked, well, okay, either you do PPI at the moment or you don't do PPI, but either way, would you be interested in learning more about PPI? And it was really pleasing to see that 85% of participants said that yes, they would be very interested in learning more about PPI. In terms of how we could support them in their PPI and outreach activities, it was very broad in terms of what facilities we could share that could be useful, from web toolkits and templates to interactive workshops, shared resources, shared funding, staff, etc. So it looks like there's a lot of scope there for us as the PGC Outreach Committee to help individuals in their outreach activities. And then lastly, we gave it an open dialogue box at the end of the survey to see what additional information people wanted to share. And this point at the top left is the only one I'm going to focus on in the interest of time. But this individual said, it seems both incredibly valuable / important and impossibly daunting on how to get started. Worried about efforts that end up just doing lip service to the idea of engagement. Yeah, it was a very useful exercise, and we were really grateful to all the individuals who took part in the survey. And now I'm going to hand back to Helena again.
Yes, thanks, Niamh. Before I do a plug to join us on the committee, I want to do another plug for the survey. If you've got an email from us asking you to fill out the survey, it'll be because you attended WCPG. And if you haven't already done so, it'd be really great if we can try and improve our numbers. And thank you so much to all of you who've already filled it out. And my second plug is for, if anything that we've said has interested you, please feel free to drop me an email. We would really appreciate new members and new ideas. And it's a really great time to join the PGC Outreach Committee. We're rethinking the way that we work and our aims and the way that we're doing what we're doing. So yeah, drop me an email, even if you just would like to know more. And yeah, and now I'm going to pass on to Cindy. So Niamh and I have been focusing on kind of the what and the why of outreach. And Cindy is going to give some examples of how from her own work.
Okay, let's take a look and see if my slides are advancing. Yes? All right. Excellent. I'll go back to the beginning. Well, thank you for the great setup, because so much of what you all have said already is going to feed directly into this talk. And I'll be talking about the work that we've done in EDGI 2, and ARFID-Gen, but also want to plug the North Carolina Translational Clinical Sciences Institute, or NC-TRACS, because their community engagement team has been wonderful in helping us figure out how best to do this. And I'm going to start by saying I am not an expert in doing this. We're just trying to do it better. And every time we run a community engagement group, I feel like we learn more and we become more vulnerable, but it really has added to the richness of the research that we're doing. It's scientifically and humanely the right thing to do. And what we don't see as researchers is amazing. Sometimes, even when we have people with lived experience on the research team, we still find ourselves being blindsided by things that we've missed. It's hard work. As was mentioned, you're really vulnerable. You're putting yourself out there when you do this work, but it's incredibly valuable and it enriches your science. It does slow things down. I'm thinking about those words about the positive and the negative valence associated with this. It does slow things down initially because the pace of what we're doing, hurry up, get a study done, we have a timeline, isn't necessarily the pace of the different communities. It's not just checking a box. And of course, some funders have, minority participation quotas, to use their terms, but that's not the primary motivator in what we do. We have a blueprint of our strategy that we printed in neuropsychiatric genetics. You can look at the PMID or the PMCID to read through that paper. And our approach has even changed a little bit since we published that, because again, each time we do this, we're learning more. So this is what I'm going to go through. I'm going to talk about some of the different consultations we've done with Black women with eating disorders, people in larger bodies with eating disorders, parents of children with ARFID or avoidant restrictive food intake disorders, Latinx parents and adolescents consulting on a brief treatment, and some of the work we've done with our New Zealand colleagues on Indigenous sample and data sovereignty. And then, of course, giving back. How do we give back to the community? So let's start with the community engagement we've done with Black women with eating disorders. Rachel Good is a member of our team. She is a social worker, and her specialty is actually working with Black women with eating disorders. And we've already done some work on this in a qualitative research way. So I'm going to be presenting the themes that came out of our groups. First off was the barriers. The barriers that participants have in participating in our research. There's uncertainty in human subjects research. The research language impacts people's willingness to participate in the EDGI study. And whenever you see 3 asterisks, that means we changed something that we're doing based on the feedback. And they considered our recruitment strategies to be aloof and inadequate for the target audience. We were not engaging Black women, and we might have been sort of like embedding a call for Black female participation in our research instead of really tailoring our outreach to their community. They also said we're not paying people enough. And this is a theme that has gone across all of our groups. And, we pay all of our ambassadors, all the people who participate in these groups, but we weren't paying people enough for all the surveys that they were doing, for providing the saliva sample. And so as we've written more grants, we've put more funds in to make sure that we're actually reimbursing their time adequately. They also said some of the facilitators for them to engage in our research was clear communication, interpersonal connection with the research team. They wanted to know who we were, why we were doing this research, and really what led us, what was our passion behind wanting to actually work with Black women doing genetic research. They also, and this was something that we have really looked at closely across all of our groups, is they want to know how their participation in our research study is going to benefit other Black women. And that's something that has come up over and over. How is my spending my 2 or 3 hours actually going to positively impact other Black women or other people in larger bodies who are going to gain from the research that we do? And then they really wanted us to develop digestible post-study information that we can feed back in ways that are appropriate. And they wanted to make sure that we actually recruited folks in areas where Black women congregate. They were like, please come to churches, please come to hair salons, please come to nail salons. Talk to us, engage with us, and reach out there, not just plastering flyers in a supermarket or somewhere around campus. So these were all super valuable bits and nuggets that we got from these groups that have shaped how and changed how we do our outreach and recruitment. And then the next group that we did work with was individuals in larger bodies with eating disorders. And those of you who don't know, there's a real polemic in the field because a lot of people who live in larger bodies feel like they are just ignored when it comes to eating disorders research and genetic research as well. So we actually engaged a fat activist who I've been working with for years to sort of be the leader of this group, to engage other folks in her activist circles to do these feedback groups. And it was a seriously emotional and very talkative group. There was lots of emotion and anger that we felt in these groups. One of the main things that they gave us feedback about that we have changed is, why are you asking all these questions about height and weight and past lowest weight and past highest weight? They find that to be just really sensitive material. And we have to ask it because some of our core research questions really have to do with what are the genetics that influence someone's ability to reach a really low weight or to fluctuate over time. And so we actually developed sort of a pop-up that just carefully explains why this information is so important for the research. And that's really helped sort of like bring down the tone and the anger and the defensiveness, and people saying, okay, I will answer these questions to the best of my ability, but we're also allowing people to skip that question if it's too hard. Because some of our patients actually do not know what their weight is, and they do not want to know what their weight is because it's just too triggering. So that was a major change that came out of this group. They also, and this is a little bit more nuanced, that they said embedded in our questionnaires is an assumption that someone in a higher weight body who has an eating disorder would automatically have binge eating disorder. And so this led to a whole conversation about atypical anorexia nervosa, which, for those of you who don't know in the field, is basically technically meeting all of the criteria for anorexia nervosa except are not at a low body weight. And people flat out said, I will not share information about this study unless atypical anorexia nervosa is included. And now the interesting thing about that, in our new study, EDGI-2, atypical anorexia still is not included. So we're actually working right now to do some crowdfunding and to try to get some additional grants from other philanthropic groups to support including atypical anorexia nervosa in our next endeavor. But again, this is where a lot of the heated conversation came up, because those people feel excluded because they can't get research, excluded because people don't believe they actually have an eating disorder, and because not enough research is being done on them, and no genetic research, except I think EDGI UK has included folks with atypical anorexia in their genetic studies. But what they describe to us is, they get all excited about being able to participate. They do the screening questionnaire, and then they're excluded. And that's incredibly frustrating. And it's yet another invalidating experience that they have because they're not sick enough to participate. So we've been super careful in explaining to people, if they are excluded, why, and making sure that we put them on a recontact list. So when we do get funds to include people with atypical anorexia, we can go back to them and we can include them in the study. They also want to see that fat folks, their term, are involved as researchers and as participants. And this is another theme that came up over and over again. We want to see that you actually have researchers on your team who are from our community, and we want to see that there are other participants from our community that are engaged in your research. They also, and this is something that we totally missed, is that, but there's nothing we can do about it. The language that we use in diagnosing people with anorexia nervosa is very off-putting for them. So when we talk about fear of weight gain, have you been afraid that you might gain weight? Have you been afraid that you might become fat? For them, who have been living through the trauma of being at higher weight, sometimes for their entire life, that language in and of itself can be extremely off-putting. We have not solved this one because we have to ask those questions in order to categorize people as having anorexia nervosa or not. But it has made us more aware, and we're thinking through constantly of how we can make this more accessible and less traumatizing to people who have other eating disorders. And then finally, and this was another piece that we've really responded to, they don't want this study to just be about genetics. They want to know that we're also looking at environmental factors, because they quite clearly said, if it's just about genetics, and if you're just saying genes have led us to be in this situation, we don't want to be part of it, because a lot of the trauma that we've had in healthcare, a lot of the trauma that we've had from being discriminated against is not going to be captured in your research. So we have made sure that we include all sorts of life events and weight stigma questions in our research. And then another group that we've worked with is we started this large ARFID study, which is Avoidant Restrictive Food Intake Disorder, Genes and Environment Study. And we brought parents in to see what would make you actually want to have your child participate in this study or not want to have your child participate in this study. And first off, they were really concerned that their kids might be embarrassed about ARFID, so they might not want to participate in the study. So the message there was to make this as inviting and to normalize this as much as possible so as not to turn off the kids from participating. Generally, and this was super interesting in this group, they were very interested in the genetic part of this research. They are so interested in trying to figure out if there is a biological component to their child's illness. So they had no qualms at all about participating in a genetic study, with the exception of sort of general concerns about confidentiality and sharing of genetic data. The majority of these folks, it was really disheartening, talked about that most of the support and treatment that they got for their kids' ARFID was actually from social media groups, like Facebook groups that were populated by parents of kids with ARFID. And they also gave us wonderful tips about language that we should use to engage parents whose kids have this problem, but don't know what ARFID is or don't even know that it's a diagnosable illness. So that really changed our recruitment materials and how we reached out to people who might think their kids are just like super picky or have extreme picky eating, but don't understand that this is actually a diagnosable and treatable illness. And then finally, this one was incredible. We presented them with like 4 or 5 possible logos that we loved, and they absolutely hated them. So they said, you have got to scrap it. You got to go back to ground zero. And we came up with the logo that you see over on the right. So, there are some very practical suggestions that come out of these community engagement groups or stakeholder groups. We don't actually use the term PPI because a lot of our patients don't like being referred to as patients. They prefer being referred to as individuals with lived experience. So we've really stuck with the community engagement term in a lot of the work that we do. And this is what we ended up creating. This is our website for ARFID-Gen. And when you go up to the website, the swing actually moves. So, we tried to make it very inviting and not stigmatizing for to engage the children in the research. And then 2 other studies that aren't genetic studies, but I'm going to talk about because, again, they've been super interesting in how they've helped us change what we're doing. We're developing a brief intervention for primary care to capture individuals who have emergent eating disorders before their eating disorders crystallizes. And it's called First Approach Skills Training, or FAST, for disordered eating, or for our Spanish-speaking patients, FAST TCA. And in these groups, we had participating parents from 4 different Latin American countries, and they gave us feedback on our treatment materials, on our recruitment materials, on just about everything that we had prepared for developing this study. The parents really underscored the importance of focusing on the impact of social media, of peers, and school on body esteem, self-esteem, and physical appearance. They felt like we had buried that information too low behind nutritional information and other information about eating disorders. So that led to a sort of reordering of the topics that we presented, and was a fairly brief treatment. It's a 4 to 5 session treatment. So the order was really important for engagement. They also wanted to make sure that within the body of the treatment, we acknowledged how hard it has been for them to find culturally competent care. It's super difficult to find interventions for eating disorders, both that address issues about being in the Latin community, but also in Spanish language treatment. So they wanted to sort of like make sure that we acknowledged the difficulty and the challenges that they have all had. But they also, even though we thought we had had a lot of focus on the family, they said you need even more. You need to have much more emphasis on familismo, on the role of the family, and even consider engaging more family members in the treatment. Because right now it is one caregiver and one child, but they said this isn't necessarily how we work. We want to have other caregivers involved. We haven't figured out how to do that yet, but it's something as we develop this treatment further that we're looking at the feasibility of doing. And this is also, I mean, we have Maylene Reyes is Puerto Rican, Mariana Valdez is Mexican, and Isabel Rodriguez is Colombian, and she grew up in Miami, and they all miss this in our treatment programs. And this is one of those things about how you can even be blinded as a researcher. You know, they basically said all of the food pictures that you have in this treatment manual are really gringo. They're like totally white. We had like, you know, a bowl of cornflakes and a glass of milk. And when we heard this, these guys who, you know, are on the team, they're like, oh my God, that's so true. How did I miss that? I would never eat that for breakfast. And my family never eats that for breakfast. So we have switched that all out for more culturally appropriate examples and images. And these groups were all done in Spanish. With the kids, with the adolescents, we had to switch it up a little bit. And they were primarily conducted in English, but there was a little bit of sort of Spanglish woven in, because a lot of the words that were related to eating disorders and family, we also had like different levels of English abilities in the adolescents. So we had to just be really aware and careful that everyone was actually understanding what was going on in the groups. And interestingly, the kids, the adolescents said, we think there's too much focus on the food aspect of eating disorders. And we really want you to talk more about the underlying emotional issues that contribute to an eating disorder. And we realized we did have a lot of nutritional information in there, and perhaps in an imbalanced way, with not enough about the emotional aspects. This bit of feedback led us to create a completely separate sort of manual of parent training, because the kids said we need to teach our parents more about eating disorders, about psychotherapy, and about psychiatric medications, because a lot of them had gone through the situation of they were evaluated in primary care, they were referred for psychotherapy, and their parents basically said, hey, you're not going. We don't believe in psychotherapy. We don't believe in you talking about issues about the family with somebody else. Or even more, where the parents accused the kids of not being appreciative of what they gave them, of being immigrants, of having made a new life for them, that this eating disorder was almost like a slap in the face. So we have created a whole sort of like parent training manual to accompany the FAST treatment manual, to make sure that we're really helping the parents understand what it means to have an eating disorder and what it means to get treatment, and to sort of work with them on destigmatizing psychotherapy. They talked about how important it is to address specific Hispanic community-specific issues. They also wanted us to include culture-specific foods, but with a twist. So they wanted to make sure that we talked about how unhealthy some of the traditional Hispanic foods are. And this got really delicate, because that can also be viewed sort of as a rejection of the culture. And balancing how to value traditional foods while at the same time having the kids being able to recover from an eating disorder it's a minefield. It's a really difficult path that we need to walk. They asked us to include religion, because it's a big part of who we are. We haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. But they also said we have to have all materials in English and Spanish, because again, the kids' facilities with English are really unequal. So we have created parallel culturally adapted instruments. And then the last little piece I'm going to talk about is those of you who are at World Congress might have heard Michaela Pedy speak. And this has been how to deal with Indigenous sample and data sovereignty. And she has just done amazing work that has really changed how we're dealing with Maori samples from New Zealand. And this is basically, we have a sort of a README for any access to the New Zealand data. And basically, this is about how to deal with Aotearoa New Zealand specific procedures for data and samples from Maori and Pacific Island peoples. And basically what this says is we recognize the taonga, or culturally significant status, of phenotypic data and biological samples collected for this study. We acknowledge that the experiences, information, data, and DNA from the biological samples provided by participants are not theirs alone, but are shared with their whānau, their family, their iwi, their tribe, and their tupuna ancestors. So giving a sample of DNA for someone who is Maori is not just their sample, but it's actually the sample of all of their ancestors. And accordingly, given these considerations, we have a completely separate path for people who identify as Maori or Pacifica and who choose to follow that path, and that is to protect the sovereignty of their data and of their samples. And we have gotten NIH to agree with this. So it took a lot of work, but they now understand that what we're doing is actually culturally appropriate. And the genotype and phenotype data from Maori and Pacifica participants will be shared under controlled access after approval by the EGI2 New Zealand Data Access Committee. The data will be harmonized with the rest of the data and analyzed accordingly, but it will not be in repositories in the same way that the non-Maori and non-Pacifica data and samples will be. So I think she has just done an amazing job consulting with her community, getting feedback, and putting this, this structure together. And our Australia group is doing the same thing now with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So we're hoping this will actually be sort of a nice template that other countries can use in dealing with Indigenous data sample and sovereignty. And then briefly, employ individuals from underrepresented groups into your research leadership and build capacity. And you can't just hope that they'll find you on your own. You need to do intentional outreach to recruit these individuals to work with you. You need to remunerate and acknowledge study ambassadors and the groups that we do these consultations with. And if remuneration isn't possible, find other meaningful ways to acknowledge that they are directly beneficial to ambassadors or groups. Like, what can help you? How can we pay back? How can we give to your community? Provide regular study and recruitment updates to the community. Consider accessibility in language, readability, and means of dissemination. We heard about that in the previous talks. And reciprocate with public lectures, blogs, or other resources for the community, and ask them what would be helpful to their community. And then create and distribute lay summaries of all your findings, implications of the research, and consider diverse ways to disseminate the scientific information. And then be transparent, address hesitancy directly. So many of the communities that we're working with might have just generations of intergenerational trauma that might make them hesitant to participate in research. Address that. Don't try to put it under the carpet. And demystify the research process. We try to make videos of every step along the way. You know, this is what happens to your sample. This is what happens to your data, so that they can actually see what they're signing up for. Make the research transparent and accessible, and be forthright and genuine about potential breaches of confidentiality and their potential impact. And then take a look at what's working and what's not. This is just a distribution of the recruitment of Hispanic participants into EGI. And as you can see, Instagram and Facebook were really the primary areas. And that can just tell you this is where you need to put your time and put your energy and put your money, because something's working. And so use that to feed back into what you do in subsequent studies. And bottom line is participants have to see themselves represented in the research team and in the study materials. And they have to understand how their participation will benefit their wider community. And that's all I have for now. So we can go to questions.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for your talks. I've been a part of the outreach committee for years now, and I still learned a lot from what everybody was saying. So I want to thank you personally. We have one question in the chat. I'll read it. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I had a question about any recommendations or examples of PPI strategies for researchers that are using secondary data sets. Are there consultation groups to help in paper planning, writing, when using cohort studies that have been collected over the past couple of decades and not just genetic data? I feel like this would be properly answered by Cindy. Since you
Helena
have
has
more
also
experience.
unmuted. So Helena, you want to start and then I can chime in?
I mean, the only thing that I was going to say is that we've been talking in the PGC Outreach Committee about publishing a kind of sister paper to go alongside your academic paper, which kind of nicely explains in more kind of lay language your findings and what they mean for people. And Cindy, you did this really well with the last GWAS of anorexia, the 2019, and you published a series of blog posts that I think people outside of academia, I doubt many people read academic articles also because they're just behind paywalls. So there's got to be another way that we can kind of get out. And whilst that's not kind of necessarily including the people in the collection of the data, it's including people in the way in which we communicate our findings. Because yeah, you can't go back in time and redo the way you did it, but I guess moving forward, you can kind of try and do the best you can with communications.
I guess the hard part about the secondary data sets is you actually need to go back to sort of like the PIs of those data sets and say, do you have any mechanisms in place to feed back science to the participants? And again, going back in time, there might not have been those, connections already in place. And then the most you can do, I guess, is actually do something like a blog post or I mean, the other thing that we've tried to do a lot is engage journalists, and train them, engage them, sort of like co-write with them or beg them to please show you drafts before they publish their articles. Because if someone participated in a study of bipolar disorder 20 years ago, they're probably still really interested in the findings. And they're probably also alert for anything that comes out in the popular press about bipolar disorder. So you might not be able to feed directly back to that cohort of participants, but by getting it out there, you might actually catch some of the people who still have an ongoing interest in the work.
I would also add, oh, sorry, go ahead, Niamh.
My only comment would be that you may not be able to get the exact group, as Cindy says, that was involved in the initial research, but there are advocacy groups out there across countries and continents. So I know in Ireland, I have colleagues who work in cancer research, for instance, and Cancer Research Ireland have, as a charity that has some wonderfully engaged activists and lived experienced individuals who are very happy to be involved in PPI events and giving their advice and their feedback, even to projects that have nothing to do with them. If it's to do with cancer, they're very happy to help. So find support groups and find PPI groups in your region, in your area. They do exist. We don't realize how many people are actually already doing this work.
And they love getting
they love getting involved.
getting involved, but also sending them something that they can put on their website or something. It's like, oh God, yes, please write something for me, right?
Yeah.
I just want to be aware of time. We're 1 minute up against the hour. If anybody else had another question, please drop it in the chat. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to all the speakers. Again, it's been very informative. And if there are any other questions, comments, concerns, reach out to any of us on the panel. And more cheers from in the chat. Excellent presentations from everyone. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you around.
Yep. Thanks for organizing it.
Thank you.
Thanks.